So, good morning. We're going to start earlier, which is quite exceptional, I think. Normally for events, always we start a bit later for various reasons, and this time we said let's do it different. Thank you all for joining. My name is Bogdan Delanu. I'm the Brussels Liaison Manager for EU-OSHA, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's session on regulation, legislation, and ethics. Before anything, I have a short announcement. We're supposed to be joined by MEP Brando Benifei, who, as many of you know, was and still is the co-rapporteur on the AI Act of the European Parliament, one of the, I would say, core legislations for everything having to do with the digital future of the European Union. Unfortunately, he was called away, but he was kind enough to send us a video message, so we'll play that in a few seconds. But before that, just wanted to set a little bit the stage for the debate. There's an interesting intersection between ethics, legislation, and regulation when it comes to the future of work, and particularly occupational health and safety in the context of the digital world that we're all facing with. We have a number of hard legislations in Europe. Of course, you know about the Framework Directive on OSH, machinery legislation, and now the AI Act. We have a number of guidelines of implementation tools that help regulate how member states and how companies and how workers will have to navigate this legislative forest. I remember actually a few years ago, an assistant in European Parliament created this matrix of European Union legislation and regulation, and he called it the blue wall of AI and digital and technological and ICT legislation. And first it had a page, and by the end it had 16 pages. And it's just lists of titles, no description. So of course it's quite complex. But finally we have ethics, which is there to bridge the gap, to help us cope with the fact that legislation is often, usually, too slow to face the speed of technological change. And that's a little bit the place where we started the debate today. I'll introduce our speakers in a second, but first, as I said, we have a video message from MEP Brando Benifei. He was and still represents the Parliament in discussions for the AI Act. In the Parliament, there's this funny thing, once a rapporteur, always a rapporteur. In a way, he's a three-term MEP, a veteran, at the time one of the youngest MEPs ever elected, and leading, I would say, the digital debate. Elected last mandate as the MEP of the mandate, together with his co-rapporteur, Dragoș Tudorache, on the AI Act. And also a previous member of the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, a current member of the Internal Market Committee, so really trying to bridge the gap between the various points of the debate on the future of work, and especially with a healthy dose of interest in occupational safety and health. He sent us a video message, and I have to be very honest to you, we just got it, so I'm hoping it's good. And if not, we'll definitely be discussing it. You know how it is, so I'll invite my colleagues to play the video. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Brando Benifei, member of European Parliament, third term, and now chairing the working group on the implementation of the AI Act. And I can say I've been involved in many of the topics you are discussing, looking at the impact of new technologies in the field of organizational safety and health at work, working on the AI Act as rapporteur and on many digital files, including the Platform Work Directive. Where can we start with this discussion, with this brief intervention I'm recording? I'm sorry I can't be with you or online live because of unforeseen changes in my institutional schedule. Where do we start? Well, we can start by where we are. What is the situation today around these topics in our workplaces? So if we see the link is quite, if we look at the link is quite evident between the challenges of health and safety at work and the use of digital technologies. We see monitoring of workers being increased. We see the impact of the data collection of hiring and firing done through technologies, the impact on the management of the work by the algorithm. We call it the algorithmic management, that is in fact changing the way the work is organized and has profound impacts on health and safety. We know about it, we read it unfortunately every day, and so it's still an unsolved situation. The technological changes are impacting on a already complex situation and creating new layers of difficulties to be confronted with. So where do we go from here? What is the state of the legislation? Well, we can see that the EU has promoted some important legislation. I will focus on AI Act and the Platform Work Directive, because AI Act has decided to put the workplace as a high-risk category as a use case for AI systems. This was the fruit of a battle, to be very frank. There were different political forces that didn't want that, pushed by some business organizations to say we do not want to consider a sensitive area the use of AI in workplaces. We managed to do that, and we managed to bring transparency measures like the mandatory information on the use of AI in a workplace, also for the social partners to be aware, and the possibility to actually do more on the field of labor protection in AI over the AI regulation, so allowing further national legislation. But as I said, the core thing I would say is considering workplace as a sensitive use case for AI, which means that the AI used in the workplace needs to be checked on important parameters regarding quality and appropriateness of data of the training, cybersecurity, governance of the data, human control. So in fact, to make this AI safe when it's used for evaluating performances and hiring and firing and acting on the workers. But also we have been prohibiting certain use cases, for example, biometric categorization and the emotional recognition of workers that we see as a illegitimate pressure and a kind of behavioral experiment done on the skin of workers without any real advantage. Obviously, we can also look at the positive sides of the use of AI, like new ways of preventing accidents and promoting safety at work. And this is very important, but we need to be aware of the risks first to get the best out of the opportunities. And then the Platform Work Directive, that's very important for a specific category of workers that are in fact under the extreme control by the algorithm, and they need to bring transparency on how the algorithm will work and to ensure more protection from the abuse on the worker by the algorithm is crucial. It's done through the Platform Work Directive and is something that is crucial for health and safety. Now, obviously, so I go to the third point from where we are, what we are doing, what we should do, and it's not there. We need to avoid that this legislation stays in paper, because we need the member states to implement, for example, in the case of the Platform Work Directive, but then we need also the national authorities for the AI Act to be in place and working to supervise and enforce the legislation. We need local authorities, we need supervision, we need inspectorates, we need to boost all the institutions that have to implement this legislation. Without that, we are talking only about a paperwork. So I think that we are paving the way as Europe in this context for a specific way of innovation when we look at the workplace. We want to gain productivity, we want to create more opportunities, we want to stay competitive. But we want to do that without sacrificing our social model, including health and safety at work, which is already failing, unfortunately, due to problems in the implementation of the legislation, contradictions, and lagging behind by some of the institutions. And as I said at the beginning, the new technologies are creating new layers of challenges. And so we need to implement these instruments, and we need to further explore other solutions, both legislative and budgetary, at EU level to support further action. For example, it will be very important that revenues generated by extra productivity through AI are also reinvested for training and learning and lifelong learning operations and programs to support skilling of the workforce to be safer in and healthier in a AI era workplace. So these are just some titles, I would say, just to give you a few elements, food for thought, they say, from the work we are doing at European level. And I'm happy to stay in touch for the next steps, in fact, of the work we have to do to implement, to avoid a retraction from these initiatives, the turning away from this work by the EU, because this is always the risk that we change course. Instead, we need to consolidate and implement correctly this way of ensuring that new technologies are not used against health and safety of workers, but instead to boost them in all way possible. Thank you very much, and let's stay in touch.
Well, thank you, and I'll make sure to extend the thanks to the cabinet of Brando Benifei for your applause, because that was quite an interesting agenda setting for our debate. Now, before I go and hand over the word to the next speaker, I just want to say that we also have online participants. We have a Slido, which those of you who don't know is an online platform allowing people to ask live questions during debates. And we'll project, I think, the QR code that you can use. Go, and if you're too shy and want to raise your hand, you can just do it from the anonymity of your phone to ask questions for the debate. Now, the advantage of having two panelists means that we can have a lot of time for questions and exchange and back and forth. We will also be able to exchange your views. So I also encourage you to check out Slido and help us kickstart that. Now, MEP Benifei, who's been at the front for, I guess, of the legislative battle, did mention quite a lot the Platform Work Directive, which at this time is one of the only legislations that goes into the algorithmic management issues that we have adopted. And that's a good segue for me to introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Jovana Karanovic, who is the founding member and executive director of the Reshaping Work Institute, which is a leading entity in the Netherlands and I think in the world for analyzing the future of work, the models and the trends. She's also teaching at the University of Erasmus in Rotterdam and has done research into how algorithmic management and the new trends in digital technologies affect workers, affect labor relations, and affect also occupational safety and health. You've had a lot of work on your hands with the Platform Work Directive, I'm pretty sure, and I guess you're one of the best people to continue the debate and look a little bit at the gaps between the legislation, the regulation, and the ethical dilemmas that still plague us now when it comes to the future of work. Please, you have the floor.
Well, good afternoon. Oh, is this on? Yeah? Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's really a true pleasure to be here at this wonderful event and to discuss and debate these important topics. I want to just throw a few things there that we can later pick up and debate together. But I want to say that the job of regulators is really not easy. It's particularly difficult because when it comes to digitalization, we're dealing with something very complex. Imagine before health and safety at work, it was much more obvious, right? injuries and so on. When it comes to digital technologies, we have to first understand them. And that's complex. Lots of problems that result and that affect health and safety are invisible. Think about mental health issues, digital overload and so on. It's invisible. It's very difficult to detect. And finally, ethics is not universal. So as Europeans, we also have to ask ourselves, what are the ethics we want to uphold? But we are not starting from scratch here. We already have digital technologies being used heavily on one group of workers. Those are platform workers. If you don't know much about it, then you for sure are a user of these platforms, like Uber, like Deliveroo, like Wolt, and so on. These platforms are particularly interesting because they have pioneered the use of digital technologies at work. For example, these companies are using algorithms to assign tasks to workers. So it's an algorithm that tells an Uber driver where to go to pick up the next passenger. It's an algorithm that evaluates worker, the performance. But also it does much more than that. It can nudge behavior. It can influence behavior. Well, what we have now is that these technologies are being used in the traditional work settings. They're being used in the warehouses, they're being used in call centers, they're being used in logistics, and all these factors that have been used to nudge platform workers are also now being used in traditional settings. It's very much borrowed from platform work, but also the gambling industry, where we have this gamification, where we are sort of having workers go along and play the games and try to tick boxes and try to get onto the next level in order to be rewarded. Or they're being launched dashboards in the middle of working hours to check their performance and so on. So I think we can all agree that algorithmic transparency is needed. And for me, that's number one thing that I want to pose here as a legislative question. Algorithmic transparency is needed. I don't think that anyone would disagree here with me, but for me, that is not the real question here. Yes, we need transparency. The real question here is who has the practical power to understand, test, and challenge algorithmic decisions? So these companies are obviously going to comply, or we hope they're going to comply with algorithmic transparency. But what did we get if workers, unions, and courts cannot meaningfully use that transparency in order to change outcomes? So for me, this transparency has to be, first of all, understood by those that it is affecting, so workers. We need much more practical solutions. It's not enough to tell us how algorithmic is doing its work. We need, for example, algorithmic transparency being introduced into onboarding processes. Once workers are starting work, they need to understand how it's going to affect them. Where current legislation, I'm not a law scholar, but as someone that has an overview of the topic, where I see the current legislation coming short, for example, is that we need transparency without usability is not helpful. So we need, for example, access to training data, because that's where the real issues come. We need visibility into the model updates. The current legislation assumes things in a fixed point of time, but algorithms are a moving target. And what more, they're learning by themselves. So that poses another big challenge for regulations. So my first important point that we need to discuss in an ethical concept is who has this practical power to understand, challenge, and test the algorithmic decisions. Second aspect that I think is really important for health and safety at work is the governance. Before, we had companies and institutions set the rules of the game. But who is setting the rules of work now? Algorithms are actually setting the rules of work now. So we have to ask ourselves, should these rules now be set by lawmakers, or should we let the system designers set the rules of work? Because essentially system designers, those very few experts that are designing the algorithms, are the ones that are setting the rules of work. And this also poses another important ethical question. Should workers accept the authority of algorithms as legitimate? We know that authority comes from law, comes from contract, social dialogue, but not from efficiency, data optimization, performance optimization, which is what the algorithms are meant to do. Governance is really moving towards technocracy, where only experts decide while workers and citizens are losing voice. Governance must move from inspecting workplaces per se to inspecting the systems of control. And the final thing I want to here bring up for the discussion, and that is data. Of course, we all agree, again, that there has to be the consent when it comes to collection of data. But what worries me particularly here is asymmetric power, asymmetric control. We have workers that, in many cases, have to sign a consent to give that data. Again, an ethical question here, is that consent meaningful if workers' livelihoods depends on it? They have to sign that consent. So on an individual level, workers are pretty much giving their entire data, including the behavioral data. And this is where we get this asymmetric control, because the company has the data on the aggregate level. And data on the aggregate level is much more powerful, right? You can do so much more with it. Let's remember that these systems are not just recording the work behavior as we had in the past. They can predict behavior. If they can predict behavior, they can also shape behavior. And of course, that introduces big problems for health and safety at work. For example, we had a number of accounts where ride-hailing companies like Uber, for example, were using psychological tricks to nudge drivers to behave in a certain way. In certain industry, if you are nudged, for example, just to complete that another ride in order to meet your bonus for the day, of course, it is not safe in an environment where there are other passengers on road, and if drivers have already been driving for 8 hours. That also translates to traditional settings. So this nudging of workers' ability to shape behavior by using these huge amounts of aggregate data leads to asymmetry of control, where companies have much more power with the workers. So with these remarks, I leave the things to debate. And of course, I want to mention that although the things may be looking gloomy, they are not always like that. There is so much that digital technologies can offer us. And as MEP Benifei said, we also first have to evaluate risks before we fully let these technologies penetrate our society. Thank you so much for listening, and I very much look forward to debating this with you.
Thank you very much, Ivana. And indeed, it's a lot of stuff to think about and to complicate matters further, because definitely it's not an easy topic. And I'm reminded of a practical example that I actually experienced myself in Romania. I was checking in at an Airbnb, of course, by the way, an online platform as well. And the lock at the door was a digital lock with a QR code. And it broke. It didn't work. The number didn't work. I called the company and they said there's a faulty door. So they sent a locksmith. That's a person who is trained to physically open the door and deal with the mechanism. And he said, no, it's not the mechanism, it's the digital programming of the QR. So they sent an electrician, but the electrician didn't know how to handle it either, because it was about the programming. So they had to send a third guy. And I was thinking all this time, imagine if there was an accident or like a faulty wiring, where was the responsibility there? And in a way, what you're saying is that the responsibility was with neither of those three people. It was the person implementing the system at the top or already designing it sometime some time back. So it's an interesting perspective, and indeed it's one of the things that I guess inspectors, labor inspectors now are having to deal with in practice when it comes to implementing the legislation, because first of all, a lot of them have been trained, I would say, traditionally, in traditional issues. You know, you go inspect the machinery, see if it's certified by the European community and everything, but now they have to look into the AI and learn a lot of stuff themselves. But that's why it gives me the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who also has to do a lot with the real-world applications of this digital revolution. And he's our second, actually, TEDx speaker that we joined today, is David Timish, who's the Global Communications and Public Affairs Manager at Generation, one of the leading largest non-profit organizations dedicated to skilling, upskilling, and connecting people to meaningful employment. His job is actually to find those gaps, but not just find them, but be able to make storytelling and help people, you know, find the real pathway in the future of work, find meaningful employment, find the skills and learn the skills that they need, and also in a very real life application. So beyond, you know, the, I would say, hefty hallways of the European Parliament and places where the legislation is being debated, but the places where it's actually being used in practice. So please, David, you have the floor.
Okay. Hi everyone, a pleasure to be here in Bilbao. It's my actually second time in this beautiful city. I was here for another conference a year ago, unfortunately also in the colder season, so I still haven't enjoyed Bilbao with some sun, but hopefully next time around. Thank you to Bogdan, Jovana for your remarks, and Brando Benifei in absentia. I indeed bring to this conversation, I think, a bit of a different perspective. Whilst I live in Brussels and actually live 5 minutes from the European Parliament by foot, I'm with one foot in the EU bubble and with one foot in the real world, as Bogdan said, because often there's a disconnect between the two. And the disconnect is because indeed many of the good legislations and policies that are being concocted within the EU institutions often, obviously, or in most cases, have to be still implemented at the member state level, and there's often a disconnect between the two. What I do at Generation.org is I lead advocacy and public affairs in Europe and storytelling and communications globally. And what we do at Generation, as Bogdan mentioned, is we focus on not just skilling vulnerable people, because that's our key target audience, but also finding employment. Previously, I used to do something similar for a big tech company until I realized that there's much more impact in the non-profit sector. And I also, on top of that, work in two think tanks as a fellow. One is in Brussels, the Global Governance Institute, where I focus on AI governance. And the other is in DC, it's called SCSP, and I'm focusing on the impact of AI on geopolitics. Today, I don't have any sort of planned speech. It's not a TED Talk. It's more of me sharing a few thoughts that, as somebody who's been working in the AI and its impact on the world of workers in society for the past 10 years, more or less. So before it was cool, I just wanted to share some of the things that keep me up at night, so to say, and why I think now it is different. So, if you ask people in the tech space in particular, and I still have really good connections across all the big American and some of the European tech companies, they will tell you most of the good things about AI and how this time is not different. It's just another incredible technology that will help us augment our skills, become more productive, more efficient at work in our day-to-day lives. That's the usual spiel, so to say. However, more and more executives, economists, academics have come to terms with the fact that this time it is a bit different simply because we live in different times. We are still much more globalized. I say still, hopefully it will continue, but we're much more globalized than 20, 30, or 40 years ago, and we're much more digitalized. If you look at the statistics since the launch of ChatGPT in November 2022, it's actually, we just celebrated 3 years since the launch, this technology, which was sort of unearthed with the launch of ChatGPT, has reached a crucial sort of a massive 20 to 25% adoption rate in the US, where it was initially launched, in less time than any other previous technological development, be it, you can go even as far as the radio, the telephone, the TV, or even as close as social media or the internet. We are seeing a technology that is massively being launched without actually the people launching it, the companies, the engineers, knowing fully how it understands. We literally unlocked a sort of a Pandora's box without fully understanding how the technology works. And as a citizen, beyond being a governance fellow and working in reskilling, I'm genuinely worried by the race paradigm with C, because this is the AI race that both tech companies and also now governing bodies, actually in the EU as well, more and more, unfortunately, but definitely in the US and in China, because of this paradigm, it seems that safety has been put a bit on the side, both in terms of safety for society, but also in the workplace. So going back to my initial mention of why is this time different, so the speed of change is what's, I think, the most important thing to look at when it comes to disruptive way that generative AI is being deployed in society. And then the second element that I think is maybe less discussed in Europe and elsewhere, it's the impact it will have not on the number of jobs, which is very difficult to predict and probably nobody would be able to guarantee for sure, but on the quality of jobs. And we already can learn, and I think Giovanna mentioned quite a bit from what happened already 10, 20 years ago from automation technologies being deployed in factories and warehouses. So we already have a case study of how when technology is being adopted with, again, the main goal of increasing profits and productivity, but again, for the bottom line of the companies, you see workers suffer. I won't name the companies, but you probably know them. You probably ordered something from them in the past. They've deployed within their warehousing and logistics networks, they've deployed technologies that are now, in a sense, making people compete with them. So I think one of the first issue I see when it comes to generative AI and its deployment is how it impacts the quality of somebody's job. Because out of a sudden, if you're a warehouse worker or a fulfillment center worker, you're no longer competing with fellow human beings to be the employee of the month to get that bonus at the end of the month. You're competing with technologies that don't need a toilet break. They don't need to sleep. They don't have issues at home. So there's an uneven competition here. And this is no longer seen just in factory floors and warehouses. This was, automation technologies. This is where myself as a nerd in this topic I was discussing about with fellow enthusiasts, like how can we help people in factories and fulfillment centers to be better protected as if it's something far sort of disconnected from our own day-to-day realities. What we see now with generative AI, the same practices are being deployed by companies around the world, again, to increase profits and productivity in knowledge work, in our jobs. And maybe it's not yet in your sort of a job, if you're lucky, but if we see what's happening in the US, which for the good and bad, because there's some good things still coming out of the US for sure, but when it comes to deployment of generative AI in companies, it has been already shown to be used to either displace people or increase the stress level of people working in leading companies. One example, and I again won't quote the CEO who said this, but by now there's quite a few, who mentioned to their employees that you cannot ask for extra headcount, so to get new help, you should do with what you have by leveraging generative AI. This is one thing that has been often shared in recent months, and the other is not just that you will not be able to add new headcount, but that if you don't use AI to increase your productivity, you might be potentially laid off as soon as there's a market correction. So people are under increasing amounts of stress, which I think for instance, for now at least, there's no policy or regulation really looking at how we can decrease this pressure that people feel, and that is again coming to knowledge workers. Sectors that have primarily been impacted so far, and this is already evident from studies, not just from anecdotal data, is particularly programming and coding, which historically has been a sector and a profession that has had a supply-demand issue, but now the issue is obviously that the entry-level workers who are programmers are finding it a bit more difficult to find work, and once they have work, unless they use AI, they might be in a precarious situation. Second, customer service and support. And third is creative jobs. There's been recently a study published just, I think, a few weeks ago by a gentleman, a researcher in Southeast Asia, who studied 180 million jobs and how they're impacted by generative AI. And his findings complement the ones from Harvard and Stanford, which looked at coding and customer support, by also highlighting very clearly that junior positions in creative work are also very, very much impacted, both in terms of the number of openings, if you're a graphic designer, if you're a creative sort of an entry-level or mid-level worker, but also not just if you're entry-level, also if you're a freelancer, because the number of posting on Fiverr or Upwork, which are common platforms for creative workers to get clients, there's also been a decrease there. So without giving you too many such anecdotes and such data-based examples, my concern is that all these cases are happening for professions that are historically not well represented by trade unions. And to be honest, the only two positive examples that I can think of over the past 3 years in which there was some sort of a voice of workers being listened to by both governing bodies and companies, incidentally, it comes from the US. One example came with the Hollywood screenplay writers just a year ago, if I'm not mistaken, in which they stood up against the big publishers and the big sort of Hollywood agencies starting to use generative AI in editing, the scripts for movies or in creating the scripts for movies. They have a pretty good labor protection, so they were able to push back. And the only other example I found, again from the US, was with dock workers. So in New York, dock workers have also risen up to the automation technologies being deployed by their employers without their consent and without collaborating with the workers themselves. And they also won and pushed back on these technologies being deployed. So these are two positive examples in a sea of deployments that are happening now at the breakneck speed. And again, they're happening in professions which historically haven't been well represented. To end on a positive note, and there is one, because I think if in the past automation technologies have impacted people in warehouses and fulfillment centers, people who historically, unfortunately, have not had the same voice that knowledge workers have, my hope is that as more and more people realize that these technologies, if used without the consent and in collaboration with workers, can actually decrease worker quality, and in some cases, it can get you fired, unless these people rise up and speak up, and unless trade unions do a much better job and labor unions to protect them, we might find ourselves in a few years in a situation in which there's indeed people who, especially in certain professions, are in a very precarious situation. And they might end up, unfortunately, needing support like the support generation is offering people around the world who are, we're targeting our efforts for long-term unemployed, people who are 6 months or longer unemployed, and these numbers have been growing. And we are operating in 17 countries, so our data is not necessarily just Europe-focused or America-focused. We see data points showing that this might be a potential scenario in the years to come in 17 countries on 5 continents. So, to sum up, in order not to end up in this scenario, we need a much better, a much stronger voice for workers, and also a much more organized voice for workers, because if just individuals raise these concerns, they will not be listened to. I think we have to sort of do it in a collective fashion, as we've seen in the Hollywood screenplay writers and the dock workers. Collective action and collective voice is what wins the day, and we still have time to push back, because as much as you hear in the media a lot about AI doing this and AI doing that, it's still us humans deploying it. It's still executives using it. So we have still agency. And I say still, because obviously there's always the scenario of AI going rogue or all sorts of exponential risks, but we're not there yet. And we still have, I think, a good 2 to 5 years to change the course and to make AI work for us, not against us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Wow, here, listening to you, I cannot not be happy that the European Agency for Health and Safety at Work decided to have this campaign theme even before ChatGPT. This is one of those moments that, because the decision was taken a little bit before the deployment of ChatGPT, but now it became more topical than I think they could have imagined at that time. Working in Brussels for a long time myself, I guess you can always look at two scenarios. There's two narratives. You work in storytelling, you have to deal with people's perceptions as well, and you see that beyond the facts, there's like stories, I would say. And you see them also in the media. I don't know if you know, there's a movie about a show, actually, a series about the downsides of technology, where you see people working and being completely controlled by AI. AI that, by the way, takes a face of like a happy face or something very cute that actually, does horrible things with now human agency. And that's one version of the story that is being, promoted by some people. And then, of course, there's like these quasi-utopical scenarios where, robots take care of every single need that we have. And we just, pursue whatever is left to pursue that AI doesn't do, which, by the way, it's ever reducing number of things. But the interesting thing for your presentation that the AI and digital technology seem to be the great leveler. What do dock workers and actors in Hollywood have in common. They both protested against AI. Previously, you'd say that a technological change, I know everybody compares AI to the loom, to the, in the textile industries in the 1820s in the UK, but the loom was only affecting a certain category of workers. Now, legal students, lawyers, young lawyers are having more and more trouble finding job because, who wants to hire a junior legal consultant when AI can do analysis of jurisprudence much faster? And as you say, maybe they're not the most represented category of work in the world. So definitely there's gaps and questions. But one of the things that I want to open the debate with is you said we still have 2 to 5 years to deal with. And we're also talking about legislation, which unfortunately is not known for its lightning speed adoption rate, and not to mention its lightning speed implementation rate in Europe, and by the way, not just Europe, abroad. So having said that, I want to open the floor to questions. We already have like 5 or 6 online questions, but let's see if somebody in the room wants to take the floor first. And if not, I'll introduce one of the first questions we get online. There's one I like. It's straight to the point. What ethical and occupational safety and health concerns should regulators address first when digital systems and algorithms begin shaping working conditions, performance evaluation, and work intensity? It's a big question at the end of the day, but you can choose where you start. What do you think, in a way, is the biggest risks, the biggest gap, which right now is open or not properly addressed, that regulators, the powers that be, should look at first? And I'll invite you to go first, and then we'll alternate.
Yeah, that is definitely a very good question. What do we regulate first? Well, one thing that we are not talking so much about, and I think we should be, and it's very important, and that is introducing third-party audits in organizations. So the way it works now, right, the companies are obliged to report on algorithmic transparency, but once they do, we're already one step too late, right? The algorithms are being designed much earlier time. So I think we need third-party audits. I'm not sure who can take that role. Some independent organizations, maybe ILO that come into the organization and do these audits of algorithms. And why is that important? For one, because companies themselves may not be aware of the risks that their algorithms are introducing. I'm conducting at the moment a study of a large online platform that matches, people to jobs. And what we have seen in the data of this company is that when the decisions are being automated, they're discriminating women. So men are getting many more jobs. The company was not aware of this problem. Perhaps they were not looking hard enough. But we cannot assume that company is aware of every problem. Of course, they should be looking into it, but some things may remain hidden. I really believe that we need, like I said, third-party audits to come in. So for me, that's important. And just another remark, when it comes to ethics, it's very difficult to regulate emerging technology, because today is AI, tomorrow is another thing. We need to also think about enduring principles, something that stays anchored into our society. And like I said, it is not universal. So, for example, we have to put in the core of our values transparency, human oversight, risk prevention, and very, very importantly, worker participation.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. And indeed, your conclusions match, I would say, the guidelines and the various studies and publications that EU-OSHA has been publishing during the course of the campaign, we're finding more and more that, in companies, I remember there was a case study between companies that were implementing AI technology, and in the real workplace change, there wasn't actually such a big difference between the two, but the perceptions of the workers and then the satisfaction and their ability to cope with the change was wildly different between the company that informed her, communicated, asked them what they think about it, and the company that did a little bit less of that. So some of it is perception, but at the end of the day, that also modifies a lot the mental health situation and the ability to cope with change, which is another pressure effect. So sometimes it's not about the AI itself, it's just the transformation stress that it brings. And it could be AI, somebody was saying yesterday, another pressure, it could be another tool. You implement a machine, you implement a new truck. But I'll allow David also to take the question first.
Sure, thank you. I will just complement what Giovanna answered, which is that I think that for me the two biggest issues are at this stage discrimination and undue surveillance, which are both exacerbated by AI if AI is used unethically and unresponsibly by employers. To give you an example, or maybe to make a sort of a side note on the discrimination, it happens a lot both within companies in which AI is being used to do performance management or performance measurement of any sort, but also a lot in hiring. Because we see now a scenario, and it's actually partially funny. There was a headline recently in the news, I think New York Times or another big publication, who mentioned something like big percentage of potential employees of candidates create their applications with AI, and now a lot of the big companies are using AI to review them. So there's like, using AI, and AI is combating AI. But even with this, there's a lot of discrimination in it because, of course, we all know the stories of bias in AI development because they were developed by mostly male engineers in their 40s from a certain demographic. So there's a lot of bias. And unfortunately, because it's the easiest solution, most companies still deploy these technologies, and it's very hard to mediate for the bias itself. And now on the undue surveillance, I just want to add that I think it's just this, comparison with the machine. And I mentioned briefly in my intervention of how it started in COVID to be surveilled because employers wanted to make sure their employees are actually working, they're not on a beach somewhere, in quarantine, so to say. But that continued now with AI in certain workplaces where they're compared again to AI agents doing the same amount of work to see how the workers are performing. And again, it's not a fair comparison in my view because AI agents are not humans, they don't need to sleep, take bathroom breaks and so on. And if you as a human are measured in terms of your performance with such a technology and you're surveilled using the same technology, it's again an uneven battle. And I think that should be definitely regulated, and more transparency and fairness should be provided by employers and by, in some cases, the tech companies developing the technologies to both society at large, but also to the employees themselves.
Thank you, David. Absolutely. For us, the bread and butter of occupational safety and health is the risk assessment. Before anything, check for risks. As a personal anecdote, I meet a lot of people who work in office buildings. They sit at the desks. And yeah, maybe the topic of their work is sometimes people working at the docks or in train stations or in trucking parkings, wherever. But they themselves live in this and work in these environments, and ask them, hey, do you know if there was a risk assessment for yourself? And of course, we all know, as a side note, that ergonomics is a big problem, back pain is a big problem, but how many of them actually do it? You'd be surprised. And then you have to ask them, and that's a basic thing, and then you have to ask them, have you done a risk assessment for the mental health of your workers, of the fact that tomorrow you've decided to deploy across your organizations this AI tool, or this recording, or summary, or whatever. And usually it's not like that. Usually it's just done because actually there's an email saying, hey, great news, tomorrow we can summarize the calls, which, by the way, I think all of us this year have seen across everywhere, because this is one of the things that came up in 2025. Now all calls all over can be summarized. But then that actually was done by somebody. Okay, it's great that they're not having to what did he say there? But that could have an impact. And there's an interesting discussion if there was a risk assessment that and how many people do that. And I just give you a very small example that has wide implications. One comment I get from online is that there are dozens of examples in the EU of trade unions having signed agreements with employers around digitalization and the use of AI at work. So that's a good news, I guess. It's good to hear, especially when employers and employees work together. At the same time, I think your point was about the gaps. Let's see if we have a question in the audience. We have a mobile microphone, so please, I'll invite the back and then.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentations, and you try to finish with a positive note, but actually...
Sorry, just a small thing. I'd invite you to present yourself so like that our speakers will know
yes,
who you
I thought
are.
everybody knows me. No, that's not the truth. I'm Demi Theodori, and I work for the European Trade Union Institute, and I'm head of the unit on working conditions and occupational safety and health. So, yes, again, I was, thank you very much for your presentations and for the introduction. You try to end with a positive note, but actually, if I listen carefully to what you say, we should stop discussing and go back and think very hard how we can prevent that things will go very bad for workers. But then I want to change a little bit the perspective, because all the discussions start from the situation that this technology is going to happen anyway, in whatever way, and we have to defend ourselves by putting, you know, some red lines. And we don't have at all the discussion, what can this technology do for us, for the workers? Trade unions are calling for humans in control. But which human will be that? Will be Elon Musk, or will be Bogdan Delenau, or we as humans? So I would really like to change a little bit the perspective and see what these very powerful underlying models can do for workers, and call for a pro-worker AI. Because there are a lot of, as you very good pointed, there are a lot of asymmetries, not even between workers and employers or the technology providers, even the ones who design machine learning models may not be able to predict or understand how these things work. So we have people designing these kind of applications and then studying how these applications are really acting in real life. So it is a school on its own. So we have to think very hard how we are going to change the development of these technologies as ask for pro-worker technology. It's actually more a statement, but I would like to think in this direction and to ask people who are, especially younger people than me, who are working on this non-stop, to think in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's take the second question, and then we'll intervene. We have a second question right there. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ulrik Spanau. I'm from trade unions in Denmark. And thank you for what you have said so far. It's really useful. I wonder how to regulate that designers of the system, they are obliged to design out risks, so take considerations of health and safety into consideration when designing, and if they can, and how they should document that this is happening, and kind of have a assessment of the risk still being there after trying to design out the risks, so to say. So just that's a question. I like the idea of third-party checking, audit. I think that's very useful. And my question is about training, because today training is about how to use the technology in a safe way. That's it. So which kind of training do we need on top of that to make sure that our fellow members, workers, they are able to take this discussion at the workplace, maybe with an employer, as you say, which have good intention but does not know. So how can they be trained to voice the fellow workers' voice, so to say? And at the end, concerning transparency, I understand it's important, and it should be, if you can add a bit more, which kind of transparency is actually enough to make it possible for workers to discuss, and for law enforcers, labor inspectors, to inspect, and not only the workplaces I learned, but also the systems, which was a very good point for me as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take this round, and then we'll do the next one. I see the hands up. This time I'll invite David and then Giovanna, so we switch it up a bit.
Great questions, but also very open-ended questions, I would say. So probably we can spend a lot of, a whole different session just to tackle them. I will start with the lady over there, which I think raised this important point, of what can we do. And I think my message actually for the EU more than anybody else, since we are in the EU and we're, I guess, all proud Europeans, is that we should not be distracted by what's happening so much in the US and China when it comes to this AI race, because I think that's a zero-sum game. It's a race also that I don't think we can genuinely win, quote unquote, on the frontier AI race. So developing these latest technologies, I think the focus should be, and I see the Commission is taking the right direction here on applying AI, and applying AI responsibly and ethically, which I think should be our focus. And by having such a focus, we can also incentivize European AI champions, because we have a few in France and Germany, to focus on allocating more resources to, as you mentioned, pro-worker AI. I mean, there's, I think, Dara Nassimoglu, one of the famous economists in the world, who mentioned how, I think percentage-wise, how little of the research the leading tech companies are allocating for AI that is used for augmentation, even though they use this all the time as AI will augment work, and how much is intended to just develop AI that automates. So even if they would allocate 10, 15% more of their existing research on developing AI that is used to augment workers, we would all be much better off. How can you do that from a legislative perspective? And that is something that, unfortunately, since we don't have the leading companies in Europe, we might be, probably blocked by our American friends a bit, is, just forcing tech companies to allocate more of their compute power. Compute is the new oil, the chips that NVIDIA designs, TSMC manufacture, and ASML in the Netherlands helps build. If you, impose on companies that 10, 15% of their computing capacity to be deployed on two things, AI for augmentation and AI for safety, we would all be much better off, I think, in 2 or 5 years. And if you have a following point, or just to, yeah, and maybe just to go down to the gentleman's question on the training part, because I know there are a few elements that probably Giovanna wants to jump on the third party, in fairness. So I work in training, and I've been doing so for the past 10 years, not just for organizations like Generation.org and for the big tech company in the past, but individually now I'm a consultant for companies deploying AI. Some interesting anecdotes from some of my clients. Because of this AI race paradigm that executives are on board, and I don't blame them because they're pressured by shareholders to deploy AI quickly, there's been a huge backlash in companies. And huge is not an understatement. They call me and pay me to actually help them to do two things. Help reassure their employees that they're still going to keep their jobs and that AI is not being deployed purely to automate everybody's work, because that's not the case. And then train their employees on how to use the technology efficiently. The problem I see is that, and again, I'm incidentally benefiting from it because that's why I'm called in, is that I would not be needed if the employers themselves would do a few things. First, before deciding what AI tool to pay subscription for or what AI company to buy, because I had clients who bought an AI startup to then use LLMs internally, they should first think, what problems do we have that AI can help us solve? And what problems we have that humans can help us solve, and they're much better than AI. That's one thing. And then the second thing, which is equally important, is those decisions to these two questions, you know, what problems will AI help us solve, what problems will humans help us solve, should not be taken in the boardroom, should be taken with the key employees leading each department. And that, surprisingly or not, doesn't happen in all cases. And then last point, the third on this sort of a trifecta, is the idea that, okay, you consult the employees once you decide what problems to solve with AI, what tools they need, and then you train them in how to use those tools efficiently. Because what we see in Europe and elsewhere, there's been a big case with the Big Four consultancy in Australia, who was, the Big Four consultancy was contracted by the Australian government, and then the Australian government found out that some of the reports they were providing were AI generated. Well, that's because the employees probably didn't benefit from how to use AI ethically and responsible training, so that they avoid such caveats. So again, collaboration, communication, and training are key, and the only reason they're not happening is because we're all collectively as a society engulfed in this AI race paradigm, which I think we should step away from, because that's what puts us in this sort of a precarious situation, both in the workplace, but also societally.
Thank you, David. And just to segue before giving the word to Giovanna, there's two comments. One is that a lot of people are blaming the AI developers for thinking too much of what can be done instead of if it should be done or developed. And this is related to what David is. Some of it is like kids playing, you know, experimenting and launching up. But beyond that, it's just related to the US and China discussion in a way. I guess we have to look very much about why people want to come to live to Europe. And I'm reminded of a speech of political activist who came once from Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa, in European Parliament, and she was having tears in her eyes when she was saying, like, you people don't understand how well you have it here, and that this is the place that we see as the dream, and that there's reasons beyond just having the best digital technologies. And let's face it, in the digital race, it's not from 5 years now, it's from already many years now, since the dot-com bubble and everything, that in Europe was not particularly at the forefront of that. But there's other things that we're very good at, in the quality and the welfare and the quality of life. So in a way, I guess the message there is to see what we are good at and develop that, not just try to compete with people where we may not be the best to compete with them anyway. But thank you for David, and I'll invite Giovanna, and then we'll have the other two questions, please.
Yeah, I mean, really great questions, and I have to be honest, I don't have answers to all of them, but I can help think along. There was a comment from a trade union about pro-worker technologies. I think that's a very good point, and we also have to focus on those examples. We have many good examples of how AI technologies are being very helpful in the healthcare industry. They're able to do, in radiology, for example, they're able to do very precise surgeries, for example. Also, if you think about Uber drivers, for example, the algorithms can actually flag, hey, you have been driving too much, is it time for a break? Things like that. There are numerous examples. But that leads me also to the other side of the coin, and that's new organizational forms, something we haven't mentioned yet. The current companies that operate in the capitalist system, if I may say like that, of course, are optimizing for profit. What we have been seeing, for example, with the platform economy, is new organizational forms, platform cooperatives. You may be heard of them. Those are organizations that are owned and run by workers. And they've implemented some of them really, really cool things, like giving data back to workers and so on. But what is the problem is that we haven't seen these companies gain a foothold or be able to compete with the mainstream platforms because they just simply cannot attract venture capital to that extent. David mentioned the race with the AI. Now we are having the same thing. Well, that's the question for regulators. Does this justify now us intervening in the markets and giving support for new organizational forms that maybe will develop pro-worker technologies, or give us an example of what can work when the profit is not at stake? I think this is very, very valid things to discuss and see, like I said, if it is justified to interfere in the market in such cases. And there was a very interesting question from the gentleman, how do we regulate the system designers? Well, that's a very interesting question. What is the issue now in organizations is that there is a disconnect. Before we had, middle management, top management making the decisions, but now we have, top management saying, for example, let's optimize for the number of jobs in the case of online platform, for example. So your job is to make sure that people get as many jobs as possible. And then there is this person, which I kind of imagine in my head in some basement. He's probably not there, or she's probably not there, but I imagine these system designers in some basement, looking at this black box algorithm and optimizing and playing with variables. But they're not thinking about the impact that their decisions are having. So the question is here, and you mentioned training, should systems designers have ethical training? Absolutely, I think system designers should have ethical training. But I also think that we need to change this process of being a collective process and give employee representatives consultation rights. This is, absolutely. Absolutely.
Sorry, I'll interrupt you because I know we're tight on time and I have a hand raised from people who have to leave afterwards. What I propose, we take 3 questions now. And there was here, the first one. Sorry, it's right here in front. Look at me. It's here, and then we have 2 gentlemen at the back.
Yes, thank you, thank you. So great work, and I just wanted to say something about the examples which have been presented from overseas about trade unions mobilizing with concerns around the implementation of AI technologies at the workplace. I wanted to say that here in Europe we have a great deal of examples of trade unions not only mobilizing but also, which is the important thing that we as trade unions do, sitting in the table together with the employers and negotiating agreements in order to guarantee fair digitalization in the workplace. We have a very good collective agreement of HIM in Germany, voice-over actors in Ireland, a European level of the educational sector in many banks across the continent, a cleaning company in Denmark. I don't know. I mean, I was writing down those coming up to my mind. It's not that I have the repository in my head, but I just wanted to make, this stand because we are very proud of, in spite of the lack of bargaining equality that we have with the employers, particularly when it comes to digitalization, the trade unions are mobilizing in order to guarantee this fair digitalization. But anyway, congratulations. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. So we have there at the back.
Hello, thank you very much for to the speakers and for this discussion. That is amazing. I am Jorge Martin. I'm from the Spanish Labor Ministry, of the Directorate General of New Forms of Employment. And I have a question because we have a concern right now. We are talking about ethical consideration and the AI Act and the General Data Protective Act. But nowadays we have a proposal of the European Commission that is the Digital Omnibus package that is curious, but for example, eliminate the obligation for training to the deployers of AI. And there's something, or there are concerns about how there are changes also from what is data personal or protective personal data. So I only want if you know about it, if you have some opinion about that, because we are concerned about these changes, no, in the EU regulation, and also in some obligations that are not right now on progress, because it start in August 2026. So it's a strange change, something that we don't have proofs that is not work, no. So this only to take to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think there was one other hand. Thank you. So again, we switch. I'll invite Giovanna now. Just to say, as a personal comment from Brussels, it's effervescent environment when it comes to the discussions. There are always cycles, I would say. If any of you remember, there was a moment in time where there was a big look at the existing regulation. It was called the refit package, and it was about making things more streamlined or, cutting red tape. There's always moments when you regulate or legislate, and there's moments when you look at what was done and how you can improve it. There's certainly, I think, waves of that just as a view d'ensemble kind of thing. Having said that, I'll invite the speakers to dig into that a bit more.
Well, thank you for letting me know about this package. I'm not aware of these latest changes, so it's good to hear. So I cannot comment on this in particular, but I can tell you that my opinion when it comes to the training is that, in the past we had institutions that were meant to provide, training and education, with universities leading the way. But these days it's very much, or it needs to become a collective responsibility, right? So we need to spread from universities to companies, a bunch of small education providers, but also workers individually themselves. This training is very complicated with the rise of the freelance workforce, with employers, of course, not having the obligation to provide the training, which can lead, to stagnation in career progression, but also real risks and health and safety risks at the workplace. So what I can say for now, is that I think we need to reevaluate our freelance model. And Bogdan, this is something that you've been discussing as well. Maybe you can jump in as well. Because when it comes to the freelance workforce, we already know, in the US, more than 50% of the workforce is a freelance workforce. We are having a rise in Europe as well, and also the way the careers are changing. Younger generations don't want to be at one job for 20 years at a time, so we are seeing much more hopping on from the jobs, which again poses the question about skills, upskilling, reskilling, and the training in general. The proposal from European Commission was here individual learning accounts, if you're aware of that. So basically that we have a bucket where different funds for a training can come, and each worker can individually decide on their own training. I believe this is a good solution, but it's not a sufficient solution because workers are not always aware of the risks that are being posed. So we definitely here need institutions and employers to take the risk and matter in their own hands.
Thank you. And I'll invite David as well to.
Sure, just briefly, so on the digital omnibus and in general, I think when it comes to recent regulation coming from the EU pertaining technology, and AI Act is one of them, I think there's, and I actually had the chance to discuss with our former co-rapporteur, Dragoș Tudorache, who's also a fellow Romanian, after he left the position, and we just, informally discussed about it. And I would say that it was a bit unfortunate of the timing that ChatGPT was launched in 2022 as the negotiations were ongoing, because personally, this is just a personal perspective, I think now with the digital omnibus and all the other sort of discussions and revisions, the AI Act has been highly diluted. So if you look at the original and where it is now, I don't think it's as representative. It's still, I think, a good piece of legislation, but my message sort of is sometimes when every problem, well, for every problem you have, you use the same tool before you fully understand the problem that might come to backfire. And my second point is that enforcement will be key, and we've seen with GDPR in the past how that was the key, because it was a good piece of legislation which the enforcement was maybe not ideal. With the AI Act, it's going to be the same. How can you make sure that each member state is actually capable and has the staff with the right expertise to implement whatever sort of a version we'll have at the end of the day? And these two questions I don't have an answer to. I do have a different, maybe contrarian perspective, which is that, again, not all things can be done via regulation. I really believe in, indeed, the EU focusing a lot on what it already does well. As the gentleman was also already saying, we shouldn't get into this AI race paradigm. We should focus on societal resilience, because many experts, be it economists, academics, believe that this AI race will, quote unquote, not be won by who develops the best LLM that takes us to AGI or ASI, but it's what society will break first. That's the risk we actually have to be avoiding. And in the EU, we actually are in a good position to avoid that risk if we don't join the same paradigm of the race, and if we double down on the best practices we already have. And on top of that, speaking of focus, of actually trying to have our own ecosystem that breeds AI champions that are truly global, because we have many very talented entrepreneurs in Europe that come up with great startup ideas, but most of them are scaling them up outside of the EU. So the message is, how can we actually focus on having a capital markets union before thinking of how to regulating AI? Because if you then come with AI companies that are value first, while still being competitive, then you have probably a pretty strong hand when negotiating with the US on tariffs or with China on tariffs and so on and so forth. And maybe just to close off on the point on trade unions, again, I'm really happy that you have all these examples, and I wouldn't expect less. I mean, we met before, I know your work. The only thing I do see is that a need to, again, refocus and provide even more resources to trade unions, because the challenges we're having now, they're unprecedented in my view. And I'm saying this as somebody, again, working in the tech sector. I know former colleagues in some of the leading tech companies who are not the engineers themselves developing them, or genuinely confused by what's happening because of the pace of change. Humans are not used to dealing with this kind of pace of change, both in terms of learning how to use a new technology, but again, in particular, how to use it responsibly and ethically. So I think a lot more focus should be given on labor, again, representation, and labor training. And resources are at the moment as we speak about this are more allocated towards defense and to potentially developing a semiconductor or a leading edge model in Europe, which maybe should not be where we put all our eggs, so to say. So let's not forget what we do already good and double down on it. I think that's my message.
Thank you very much, David. Before I conclude, I say we still have more time for one more question. If anybody wants to make one more comment. I'm looking online and in the room, but online most of the questions have been actually repeated. One thing that always comes up is how can legislation keep pace with the level of technological change? And I'll invite you just to reflect on that briefly before we conclude. What do you think? How can we keep pace? You said we have 2 to 5 more years. Giovanna, you're talking about the speed of it as well. And now, of course, there's concerns with the revamp and the re-verification and coming back to regulation that was adopted some years ago because maybe it's not up to date or maybe it needs revision. And all that takes time. All the while, I lose track of how many practical applications there are of new technologies that, for example, impact occupational safety and health.
Of course, one quick answer here is the cross-border cooperation. And of course, in EU that's assumed, but in practice it's not always the case because we of course have the national legislations as well. And we have seen this with the Platform Work Directive, that each member state will probably have their own way of regulating platform work, and that is problematic. It's problematic from the competition standpoint on the global level for Europe, because we need to start innovating, not just regulating, right, in Europe. And the legislations when it comes to health and safety need to be unanimous across. So cross-border cooperation is definitely should be a priority, and also the shared databases across Europe about health and safety at work.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. David, what do you say?
I mean, this is the age-old question. I think there is a fine balance to be struck between regulation, which is definitely needed, and innovation. And I think in Europe, up until this point, we probably put, again, too much of our bets into just one side of the sort of a balance, which was on regulation. Now we realize that, okay, we have to balance things a bit better. What I think the EU can do, and I think it has been historically pretty good at this, even though now we live in, I think, unprecedented times, is to set a very clear vision for where we have to go, because at the end of the day, policy will never catch up with technology, and I don't think we can even expect that to happen. But I think if you have the right frameworks in place and the right structure, and to be agile when it comes to regulation, and to sort of not be prescriptive about it, but provide, a framework structure, I think that's what the EU is well positioned to do. And hopefully will not forget that it has the strengths and try to go prescriptive on something that it evolves faster than even our capacity to understand how it works when it comes to AI. So focus on providing the vision and the clear framework, and then double down when it comes to the enforcement time, because that's where historically we might have a bit more work to do.
Thank you very much, David. And I wouldn't be doing my job right if I wouldn't say that one of the, I think, places where this intersection between the various stakeholders, you were mentioning very much trade unions and workers, and of course the interest of employers, is through the Agency for Health and Safety. We are a tripartite agency, so actually through our board, through our focal point network, through our stakeholders, there's actually a space for dialogue and as well for the trans-border cooperation and exchange. And we've looked today at a lot of, I would say, possibly negative implication, and not just possible, but very real negative implication of new technologies, and especially gaps in legislation, regulation. I guess the linchpin here is the ethical part, because before you manage to legislate and then to implement guidelines, it's good when we all agree on general ethical frameworks for how we want our workers to be protected and safe. And I guess if we have to look at one of the competitive advantage of Europe from certain points of view, that's clearly one. I remember in the US last year or this year when the new administration came in, they started to put bills like, let's take down that institution, let's take down that institution. Even the US OSHA was at some point on the line. I don't think there's any doubt in anybody's minds, no matter where they're from, that occupational safety and health is a key value beyond, I would say, the legislation that we have, which is also quite strong. And I want to end up on a positive note to give you a good news, because as we were speaking, the European Commission just announced, and our dear Executive Vice President announced the Quality Jobs Roadmap that will launch actually a first stage consultation with social partners on algorithmic management and artificial intelligence at work, and new technologies and mobile digital equipment on safety and health at work. So as we're speaking, things are moving. That's the nice thing about Europe. Some people sometimes complain about speed, but the good thing is that things are always moving. And I hope we're all moving in the same direction. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our dear speakers and the online audience for the questions. See you.